On January 3, 2026, operators in low orbit first saw a number that should never have appeared. Not +5 warnings, not a weather spike, but a sharp increase in proximity alerts for objects not listed in any catalog. It looked as if the amount of debris around Earth had increased overnight, but debris doesn't just appear out of thin air, and it doesn't appear on a strict schedule. But here it was, and not at random times, but precisely when 3i Atlas entered the right sector relative to the orbital plane. The first alarms reach those who detest them: satellite operators, those who run commercial constellations, those accustomed to calculating risk in percentages and dollars. Their warning systems began to howl in unison: conjunction alert, object unknown, track not correlated. At first they tried to blame it on the software: an update, a correlation glitch, errors in the Doppler measurements. This is what usually happens when a sensor network picks up ghosts and can't stitch them together into tracks. The only problem was that the ghosts were behaving too relentlessly. They appeared in batches, briefly, in different planes, and each time Atlas stood nearby in the geometry as if its presence activated some kind of mode that pulled these marks out of the noise, as if the system's sensitivity had been adjusted, but not manually. By morning, the list of alerts no longer fit into the standard reports. The operators at LEO began to have a different conversation, quiet and angry. If these are real objects, we're blind. If these aren't real objects, someone is making us blind right now. The most disturbing thing happened during a dead coincidence. 3 independent observing networks, which almost never perfectly align in time, showed the same window. The rise of uncorrelated markers coincided with ATLAS's passage through the same patch of sky. This already killed the explanation your device is acting up because the mischief doesn't synchronize globally per second, but here it did, and in such a way that it was visible. The surge starts, holds, fades, and then starts again at the same rate. When radar data was added to the chain, the atmosphere in the rooms grew heavier. Steady reflections appeared on the screens, too much like small, solid bodies, not a dust cloud, not a plasma trail, specifically something that could hold its shape. And then, for the first time, a phrase that's usually not said out loud was uttered: if Atlas is dragging debris behind it, it's not a tail. It's a mechanism. Because a typical comet tail doesn't scatter compact targets in low orbit that produce a radar response. But the pulling option was also terrifying in its own way. For something to be pulled toward LEO, the object must interact with orbital space as if it were leaving a distinct trace there. Either the particle stream is charged in such a way that it can be picked up by the magnetosphere, or the stream contains large fragments that were previously invisible. The second option sounded even worse. It's not junk, it's disguised as junk. LEO is already full of objects, and the noise is the easiest way to hide something you shouldn't find. If you want to confuse tracking, you throw thousands of almost objects into the system and the network chokes. The first to grasp the scale weren't scientists, they were air traffic controllers. People who don't argue about the nature of the phenomenon, they look at the probability of a collision. And they saw that probability began to behave not like randomness, but like someone's hand regulating the density of risk. One of the reports, sent over a secure channel, contained a brief statement. We are observing a localized densification of uncatalogued tracks in a sector coinciding with the line of sight to 3I/ATLAS. Translated into everyday language, it seems like the Earth's surroundings are getting denser when Atlas is there. A few hours later, the maneuvers that had already been planned began to be cancelled. Not because they were being stingy with fuel, but because, with such an avalanche of unclear objects, any maneuver could lead the satellite straight into something you can't see. And here, those who are usually kept under wraps entered the picture: space situational awareness centers, military surveillance units, and agencies that see more than is publicly disclosed. Their response was immediate and quiet. Some of the data was relegated to the shadows. The public feeds continued to function. Everything seemed tolerable there: occasional warnings, general remarks about catalog dynamics. But in the private feeds, a different kind of math began. There, they counted not how many objects, but how they appeared, and the picture emerged with an almost humiliating logicality. The burst begins when Atlas crosses a certain arc across the sky. The burst subsides when it exits this arc. Then it repeats on the next orbit, as if the object were scanning Earth's orbital ring. That's when the theory that sends shivers down your spine was born. It's not Atlas pulls garbage, it's Atlas highlights garbage. In other words, it changes the conditions, so that what wasn't previously registered begins to be registered all at once and everywhere. It could be anything, and anything sounds dangerous. Plasma densification along the line of sight, creating false radar targets. Microscopic fragments that become radio contrast due to charging. or even a separate group of small bodies that is released and resonates with observation networks. But this version had one nasty bonus. If it can highlight and silence, then it can control what our systems see. And then the increase in alerts isn't a problem of junk. It's an overload test, a check on our response. The following coincidence was too perfect. During one of the warning peaks, two devices in different planes received the same avoidance advisory as if they were being guided to the same safe corridor. Randomness doesn't work that way because randomness doesn't draw corridors, and it was after this that an emergency call was made to NASA, which no one outwardly knew about. Officially, it was coordination for increased SSA workload. Unofficially, it was an attempt to understand why LEO had begun to behave like a living system, reacting to an object outside its orbit. If Atlas is indeed dragging a ring, it means one thing. It's leaving a structure in our space that lasts not minutes, but hours and days. But if it's illuminating what's already there, it means something else. It's found a way to tweak the strings of the surveillance infrastructure itself, and in both cases, the next step is obvious and unpleasant. If you can create chaos with warnings, you can force operators to waste fuel, disrupt schedules, and open up windows for errors. And errors in orbit aren't just a headline, they're a cascade. At the end of the day, one of the engineers who almost never writes with emotion left a single line in the comments to the graph. The system looks like someone is checking how much garbage it takes to make us stop trusting our own eyes. At this point, the story stops being about garbage. It becomes about control. About how an object, supposedly just passing by, is interfering with the most vulnerable layer of our civilization, the orbital layers, where everything depends on forecasts and trust in data. The filtering system activated at 3:17 Kiev time, and for the first 5 minutes, everyone felt the panic was unnecessary. The algorithm cleared half the marks as unstable, and the threat graph dropped almost to normal. Then came a warning, the kind you don't want to see even in a simulation. An object with no number, no history, no correlation, but with a trajectory that looked like a mockery of orbital mechanics. It was going against the grain. Not perfectly retrograde, not textbook perfect, but slightly off-center, so the computer couldn't decide whether it was LEO, MEO, or just junk in a transfer orbit. Too smooth for noise, too strange for rock. The most disturbing thing was the speed of approach. It didn't match any random scenario, where the object simply crossed the plane and disappeared. The speed seemed precisely as if someone had set it precisely to maximize anxiety. An operator at one private constellation was the first to say out loud what was usually kept silent. This isn't garbage, this is a reaction test. And at that moment, the sound of people stopping breathing could be heard in the room. Meanwhile, another team tried what they always do when the data goes crazy. They superimposed geometric windows, where Atlas was, where the line of sight was, where the radars were active at that moment, and where the optics were silent. And it turns out that the countercurrent object appears only when Atlas passes through a sector that, to Earth, appears as a narrow wedge between magnetic fields in the upper atmosphere. Not pretty, but suspiciously stable. That is, it's no longer simply in the right sector. It's in the right configuration for the entire Earth magnetosphere orbit system. There are too many coincidences to dismiss and move on. At the same hour, two aircraft at different altitudes received the same evasive action, as if they were being directed to perform the same maneuver from different points. This doesn't happen when the warnings are independent. If this was a real target, it should have been detected somewhere else, in the optics, in the radio, in any other circuit. But at that very moment, some of the optics produced bad frames, and some of the radio lines faded into noise. It didn't look like human sabotage. It looked like a glitch that chooses the minutes. Glitches don't happen exactly where they're needed most, but here they did. By dawn, a new term had appeared in the reports, cold and convenient, 3I/ATLAS escort anomaly. You could utter it in a meeting without embarrassment, even if everything inside was screaming. And then the calls began to those agencies that always sit just above public science, where they don't discuss hypotheses, but make decisions, which windows to close, which data to hold, which channels to silence. And at the same time, someone at NASA insisted on a simple step that sounds almost comical. Check to make sure we haven't overheated the sensitivity. That is, to make sure we haven't turned on a mode that makes ghosts visible. The test was quick and humiliating. Sensitivity was indeed raised, but not enough to produce such tracks. And most importantly, it didn't explain the global synchronicity. Then they turned on the second level of analysis. Not what is it, but how does it activate? The time of the marker's appearance was compared not with the satellite orbits, but with the position of Atlas relative to the Earth's terminator, and the picture became even more unpleasant. The bursts occurred more frequently at the day-night boundary, in a narrow band where the ionosphere is capricious, and where any weak effects become loud. Someone said, if it can work through the upper atmosphere, it can influence what our radars see. It sounds like fantasy, but the numbers were too accurate to ignore. At that moment, a theory emerged that makes your throat go dry. Atlas doesn't physically drag debris. It creates conditions in which orbital space becomes a mirror where false structures emerge. So, he doesn't throw stones, he changes the environment. And then, the ring of debris isn't a tail, but a trace of the impact, visible as a compaction of targets. It's as if someone is drawing interference, but interference with form. Things got worse. One of the military radars, usually silent, issued a short confirmation. There are persistent reflections, but they don't last longer than a few minutes. They appear in bursts. Series. This word stuck in my mind because series aren't random. Series are like a procedure. Like taking a pause, then a repeat. If this is scanning, then the target isn't the atmosphere or the sky. The target is us, our reactions, our maneuvers, our algorithms, our blind spots, our habits. And this is where the real trap begins. When you're not sure the tracks are real, you're afraid to maneuver. But if the tracks are real and you don't maneuver, you lose. The operators tried to find a middle ground, make minimal adjustments, conserve fuel, and only avoid the most reliable targets. This is reasonable until someone starts exploiting your caution. Then one device received a warning that was no longer undefined. The target had a repeatable signature, appearing 3 times in a row at the same interval, as if it were being deliberately shown over and over again. The worst part, it appeared on a line such that any evasive maneuver would lead the satellite closer to another series of markers. It was as if you were being offered a choice between 2 bad options, both of which had already been taken into account. By this point, they weren't arguing over whether the ring existed. They were arguing over who controlled its visibility, because if the ring rose and fell in the data, it meant someone was controlling not objects, but our eyes. At the next closed call, a phrase was heard that they tried not to record in the minutes. We do not rule out a targeted load on the SSA systems in connection with 3 I/ATLAS. It was almost a confession, only without the words reason and management. That's how bureaucrats talk about what's too scary to say outright. And that same night, something happened that finally shifted the story into a different genre. One of the satellites, which should have been safe by all calculations, suddenly lost its orientation for several seconds. Not a failure, not an accident. A brief disruption, after which it returned to normal. But just then, a series of uncatalogued targets flashed in the data again, and Atlas was once again in the correct geometry. You can handle a coincidence once, twice as hard. By the 3rd time, you start thinking not about probability, but about motive. At 5:41 Kiev time, a report landed on the desk, after which it was no longer possible to pretend it was orbital noise. 3 independent circuits showed the same thing, but each in its own way, and it was this coincidence that proved the main blow. The first circuit was civilian. Catalogs, warnings, approach calculations. The second was military. Narrow beams, short confirmation packets, minimal commentary. The third was space weather, the ionosphere, plasma, the kind of lines usually discussed only in boring seminars. And here's the problem. Civilians saw the ring as a dense rain of targets. The military saw the structures as stable reflections, and weather satellites saw a thin band of disturbances exactly where these marks flashed. When 3 different worlds express the same outline, just in different terms, it's no longer a matter of probability. It's a matter of causality. And then the question becomes very simple. Who is the cause here, ATLAS or us? NASA didn't say it out loud, but the data request sounded as if they already suspected the answer. They asked not for images, not for spectra, not for pretty graphs, but for raw telemetry data on time, phase, angle, transmitter power, and filter modes. They didn't need an object, they needed a mechanism. How exactly does a system begin to see the unnecessary? Because if it's the physics of the environment, then it can be caught. But if it's a game against our logic, then it will be harder to catch. At the same time, the ESA has revived an old practice, often considered paranoid, comparing raw data with blind measurements where the sensor is active but the recognition algorithm is disabled to avoid imposing a pattern. And it was there that the most unpleasant gap occurred. In the blind data, some of the marks disappeared as if they had only existed after processing, but others remained, weak but stubborn, like a thin thread that couldn't be attributed to the software's whims. This split the group in 2. Some said it was a processing artifact, and we could rest easy. Others said the opposite, meaning there was a genuine weak signal that the algorithm was inflating, because it was programmed to be wary. And if the latter are right, then someone has the perfect tool. There's no need to create thousands of objects. Just create a weak modulation of the environment, and our security systems will do the rest. At 6:09 a.m., a private operator, the same one who'd said, "This is a test," the night before, contacted us with a dry phrase. He was planning to perform a diversion, not as recommended, but rather a transverse one, at minimal impulse, purely to test a hypothesis. They told him sharply, almost rudely, that they didn't do that. Too many risks, too little data, but he insisted, and he had an argument that irritated everyone. He pays for the fuel himself, and the consequences are his too. The maneuver was small, not elegant, not heroic. It involved shifting the plane slightly, disrupting the expected pattern, and breaking the corridor into which the algorithms force all spacecraft with identical decisions. And right after that, something happened that sounds like a bad joke. His warnings disappeared. They didn't become less intense, they didn't become weaker. They simply vanished, as if someone had turned off the lights in his particular sector. For the first few seconds, everyone thought he'd knocked out the filter, ruined the forecast, and gained a false sense of calm. But then, the military network confirmed that his zone had indeed become quiet, the reflections had disappeared, and the ionospheric band had shifted hundreds of kilometers. That is, the noise escaped not into his system, but from space. It was as if someone had shifted the background noise to the side, making way for it. And this no longer resembles physics, which works fairly and equally for everyone. Someone at a meeting quietly said something that really cuts your teeth. If you change your behavior and the environment changes in response, then you're interacting not with garbage, but with an observer. No one laughed. Almost immediately, a second strike arrived. On the other device, which remained in the correct corridor, the number of warnings doubled. It was as if the load had simply been shifted so that the overall pattern would remain intact. It was like redistributing pressure in a system. You relieve the load at one point and it increases at another. That's how controlled processes behave, not random clouds of dust. At 6:32 a.m., NASA requested an emergency snapshot of the sky, not from optical instruments, but from deep space radio instruments. They wanted to see not a body, but a trace, a plasma structure, a fine mesh that optical instruments couldn't detect. And at that moment, something strange happened again. 2 radiolabs produced images showing a faint gradient, like a long shadow, appearing near the ATLAS trajectory. But a third lab, with similar settings, saw nothing. 3 identical instruments shouldn't diverge so dramatically if the cause is simple. If the cause is complex, depending on geometry and phase, then yes. And this again brought back the idea that the effect is triggered by conditions. The night ended, but the tension only grew, because the garbage ring was no longer perceived as a tail, but as an interface, a way to put pressure on our orbital infrastructure without direct contact. And then a question arose that had previously been feared to be uttered, even hinted at. If this is an interface, what is the signal? What exactly triggers it? Atlas's proximity, its orientation, or that we turn on the radar and start monitoring? The answer was almost mockingly beautiful. At 7:05, when several radars went on a minute-long technical pause, the series of blips almost completely disappeared. When the radars returned, the series returned as well, as if it had been waiting. This didn't prove intelligence, but it did prove dependence. And the dependence looked as if someone was hearing our impulse and responding to it, not immediately, but with a precise, repeatable lag. At that moment, one of the senior space weather specialists proposed a test not usually offered publicly. Simultaneously turn on and off pulse modes at different points around the world, in a predetermined sequence, like a code. And if the ring responds to the code, it won't be a dispute over artifacts anymore. It will be a dialogue, albeit a primitive one. Even if the response is simply a physical resonance, the result will be terrifying in its own way. They scheduled the first sequence for the nearest window, a short one, exactly 10 minutes, so as not to attract attention and not cause problems for the operators. Everyone understood that it could end in nothing, and everyone understood that it would be worse if it did end in something. Because if an answer comes, the next question will be inevitable. Who exactly is answering? Space debris doesn't answer. The ionosphere itself doesn't respond with a code either. It makes noise, but it doesn't repeat steps like a ruler. And where does Atlas fit into this scheme? It's the guest at the center. It's the only variable that appeared, and the world around it began to behave differently. And that's precisely why it hasn't been perceived as just a comet for a long time. At 7:18 Kiev time, the test was launched without fanfare, as if they were launching something they'd later deny. 10 minutes, 4 sites, pulse modes turned on and off according to a predetermined code to test the reaction. The procedure was simple and brutal. The station in Canada sends a short burst, Chile remains silent, Australia repeats after a fixed lag, and Europe delivers a final pulse. If it's just garbage, the image shouldn't recognize the steps. For the first 30 seconds, everything seemed dull, and that was almost a relief. The warnings came out of inertia, the background had a life of its own, and the graphs resembled a normal night when the system is nervous for no apparent reason. And then, At the third step mark, the ring did something statistics don't do. An identical group of marks appeared in two independent catalogs arranged in an arc, exactly in the sector where Australia was looking according to the code. The arc held for 8 seconds, then disintegrated, but not chaotically. It slid along the orbital plane as if someone had dragged it off the edge of the screen, preserving its shape rather than disintegrating into noise. The operator in Chile, who was supposed to remain silent according to the code, saw things even worse. His passive sensors picked up a faint reflection at a time when there were no active pulses at all. This appeared to be a response not to the signal, but to the circuit itself. Someone said the word interception. No one specified what exactly they were intercepting, an impulse, a schedule, or an intention. The room grew so quiet you could hear the server rack fan. 6 minutes into the test, Europa sent its final pulse, and one of the military radars received a mirror as stable as a metal surface. Not a dot, not a cloud, but an elongated edge that maintained phase. The most terrifying thing wasn't that the reflection appeared. The most terrifying thing was that it didn't appear where they expected it. It surfaced on the side that, according to calculations, should have been empty, and this disrupted the usual geometry. Almost immediately, two LEO operators began receiving proximity alerts, as if someone had suddenly poured objects into their orbit. One spacecraft took evasive action without confirmation, simply because there was no time for discussion. At the same moment, weather satellites noted a thin band of disturbances over the Atlantic, directly beneath the projection of this new edge. The band appeared and disappeared faster than such events typically last, but it managed to align with the axis. NASA ordered the test stopped at the 9th minute, without waiting for a full cycle. Officially, it was because of the risk to the orbital constellation. In reality, it was because they had seen a reaction, and any further testing could now be seen as a challenge. The private pilot, who had previously left the corridor and received silence, attempted to repeat the maneuver on the next orbit to see if the effect would persist. This time, there was no silence, and it was a direct warning. His sector was once again blanketed in a shower of markers, but now they were denser and closer to his craft's actual altitudes. It was as if the system had taken into account his previous attempt and closed the loophole he'd accidentally discovered. At 7:44 a.m., ESA received a strange addition to its radar data from an observatory. A faint spot, like a false star, appeared on the optics near the Atlas path, and it persisted during the exact minutes of the test. This point wasn't cataloged, didn't coincide with any known satellites, and didn't behave like a blip. It behaved like a tethered marker that only appears when we start playing the synchronicity game. By the end of the hour, their main conclusion sounded too cautious to be safe. The effect correlates not with power, but with timing. And if this is true, then we're shining a flashlight not into space, but into a system that reads rhythm. And then they were left with one question no one wanted to address. If Atlas had nothing to do with it, why did it all start with it? And if it did, what exactly was it testing, and what would happen when the testing was over? At 8:11 Kiev time, the false star flared up again near the Atlas route, and now it not only held but shifted by exactly the amount given by the orbit recalculation after the microcorrection, as if it had known the update before us. 3 minutes later, on the other side of the world, an amateur with a camera who had already caught something too much sent a shot. The dot appeared in the same relative position, although he had different optics, different air, different exposure, and a completely different piece of sky. The worst thing about such coincidences is that they leave no room for your imagining things. If two independent points see the same reference to an object, the problem is no longer with the camera, the sensor, or pixels, on the edge of noise. NASA did what it always does when the truth isn't yet in the paper. They didn't deny or confirm. They simply asked for the raw data and then blocked access to the telemetry that could explain why this is being seen now. At 8:27, a short message popped up in the closed LEO chat. Two operators had again seen an increase in the number of unexplained approaches, but this time the objects were not uniformly orbiting. They were lying in a thin layer as if someone had laid them out flat. And it was precisely into this same layer, according to the ballistics calculations, that Atlas looked for a minute with its active side, the very sector where they had previously observed a strange discipline of its jets as if it could maintain the direction of the task. At 8:33, the ESA opened the archives for the last 24 hours and found an unpleasant detail. Every time the false star appeared, it appeared not just anywhere, but precisely during those windows when the ground-based networks entered synchronous time modes. That is, it responded not to brightness, not to phase, not to distance, but to our coordination, to the very fact that we were working in sync as a single system and not as disparate observatories that could be ignored individually. At 8:41 a.m., the false star did something no one wanted to see on screen. It split. not like a binary star in the atmosphere or a trick of the eye, but as two stable markers, maintaining a fixed distance between them. This distance remained constant even when the zenith angle and observing conditions varied, which eliminated atmospheric explanations. The two markers behaved like a structure that maintains its own geometry, not like light noise at the limit of sensitivity. The secretary on the emergency call recited a number that's usually not read in a room without security clearance: 2-point phase response stability. And after that, the conversation fell into a moment of silence where everyone understood, because phase stability under such conditions suggests reflective surfaces or emitters with controlled synchronization, and this is no longer a comet with a pretty tail. It's an object that either can respond or can simulate a response. At 8:55 a.m., one of the military radars attempted to catch both markers with separate beams, similar to how a target is split into two tracks. The response was strange. The track collapsed into one, as if the system had detected the attempt to separate them and was only showing what it wanted. 5 minutes later, the LEO debris ring came alive again, but now the proximity alarms weren't coming in waves, but in series, all at the same pace, like a metronome. This isn't the behavior of random debris, it's the behavior of a schedule set by someone. At 9:07 a.m., weather satellites provided another piece of the puzzle. A narrow band of ionospheric bursts passed along a line aligned with the direction of Atlas at the moment the second marker appeared. The band was too smooth to be just background, and at that very moment, bad angles began to appear on large telescopes. Flare, awkward phases, poorly positioned windows. It was as if all the world's optics had suddenly found themselves in the wrong place, even though, according to the calendar, it should have been the best hour of the week. Then someone said quietly, almost professionally without hysteria, "If this is a beacon, then it's not for us." And this sounded more terrifying than any theory, because beacons are not installed for beauty, but for guidance and synchronization. At 9:19 a.m., NASA issued a short statement in plain English, sounding reassuring. But internally, a different order was sent: cease all active sensing and switch to passive acquisition mode, as if we were afraid of triggering a reaction. And here's where the story takes a turn, because passive collection means one thing: we stop checking and start waiting, and waiting is the worst thing in such situations, because if the target is truly reading our rhythm, they've already understood that we've understood. At 9:23 a.m., the operator at the geostationary communication station did what experienced people do when the oddity repeats. He overlaid a marker on the sky map and, just to eliminate the possibility of a fluke, turned on the uplink/downlink of two commercial satellites. He wasn't looking for a sensation, he was looking for geometry, and geometry hit him in the face. The false star was positioned not near or approximately, but almost perfectly on the line that was currently carrying traffic between the ground station and the satellite. At 9:26 a.m., the line shifted due to a channel switch, and the marker moved with it. Not across the sky in the usual sense, but in the reference coordinates, as if someone were holding the point not in space, but in the communication topology itself. At 9:29 a.m., the second operator, unaware of the first, wrote briefly in the general chat, "We're seeing a strange increase in errors on narrow lanes, only where the sector coincides with the object." This was no longer about optics or the atmosphere. By 9:34 a.m., a table of timestamps had spread across the internet. There were no fancy words, just a dry sequence. The appearance of a marker, a surge in the ionosphere, a series of LEO warnings, degradation of communication channels on narrow frequencies, and then another marker. And all of this happened within the same hour, as if someone were testing the Earth system layer by layer. First, observation, then reaction, then testing how we respond, and then observation again, using new parameters. At 9:38 a.m., one of the engineers said what everyone feared. If it's tied to the communication lines, then he sees the sky differently than we do. He sees our beams. And the room grew crowded because the beams couldn't be hidden. You can close the telescope's dome, you can postpone the observing session, you can turn off the camera, but you cannot stop being a planet that communicates with its orbit. Our radio lives above the atmosphere like light on water. At 9:44, the false star flared again, but this time not as two dots, but as a short dash, as if someone had drawn a line. The dash lasted for a few seconds and then disappeared, leaving behind a repeating error in the communications telemetry. This error looked like a jitter in synchronization, but not chaotic, but stepped with the same step, as if someone were trying different phases and seeing at which phase the Earth system began to float. At 9:50 a.m., the military attempted to cut off part of the spectrum and switch to backup procedures. This usually solves the problem if interference is the cause. It didn't solve this problem. The error went away, but instead, noise increased in another area, as if the response had come directly from the alternate channel. At 9:56 a.m., one of the major telescopes announced an empty window under the guise of calibration. Formally, this is a normal phrase. Informally, it's used when they don't want to leave a mark on the public schedule. A minute later, another telescope in another country did the same, and if before it seemed like a coincidence, now it became a pattern. Not because everyone was conspiring, but because everyone saw the same thing and was equally frightened. At 10:03, at precisely that moment, Atlas passed the sector where, according to calculations, it should have produced the best passive radar signal, and precisely at that moment, several independent systems reported a background signal as if the target had disappeared, leaving only the sky. People who've worked with noise their entire lives know the difference between a weak signal and a signal made to look like noise. A weak signal has character. A substitution signal's character is too smooth. At 10:09, a private user posted another image, but this time it wasn't about the dot. A barely noticeable segmented structure appeared near the Atlas tail, as if someone had sliced the stream into uniform sections, like clock pulses. He didn't write theories. He wrote one thing: rhythm. And this word turned out to be more important than any theories, because rhythm doesn't just appear on a scale where everything should be random and messy. At 10:15, NASA held a second call, this time without extra people. This call isn't for discussions, it's for when a decision is needed before an explanation can be provided. The solution was simple and terrifying. Stop actively attempting to highlight the object, capture as much passive data as possible, and prevent the object from understanding where we're looking. That is, accept that the object can respond to attention. At 10:22, the false star made its final move, after which many lost the desire to argue. It appeared where there were no communication lines, no telescopes, and no radar. It appeared precisely on the Earth-Moon axis, and it didn't seem like a new anomaly, but rather like a message. As if, after the communications test and the observation test, he'd shown us the simplest thing. He understands geometry. He understands that we live between the Earth and the Moon, as if between two lighthouses. At 10:28, LEO began issuing another stream of proximity warnings, but now the objects were arranged not in a layer, but in an arc that followed a fragment of Atlas's trajectory, as if it were pulling order, not junk behind it. And at that moment, someone in the room quietly uttered a phrase that would never be recorded in any official report: "It's not a comet next to us. It's us next to his experiment." The pulse returns with a delay equal to the distance to ATLAS, and after it, a strange, overly synchronous silence begins on the official channels. The third independent instrument was not a telescope in the usual sense, but a receiving system that can hear weak reflections against the background of the Earth's own noise. They weren't looking at the picture, they were looking at the time, at the milliseconds, at the way the signal came in, broke down, and somehow repeated itself as if someone was answering. First came a short beep, like a click, then silence, then a second beep, and between them there was a pause, which suspiciously coincided with the estimated round-trip delay. This wasn't a pretty theory or a similarity, it was a number. The time it would take a radio signal to reach the point where Atlas should now be, and back, without any allowance for mood. The engineer who first noticed it didn't shout. He made it worse. He printed out the log, put it on the desk, and simply said, "It's not noise. It's a return." Discipline immediately took hold in the room. No one argues with the return. It's not discussed, it's tested 3 ways, and if it stays, the rules change. They ran the recording through a different path, changed the frequency, adjusted the window, and removed local interference. The return occurred again, only with a slightly different profile, as if it had adapted. This was the moment when the object ceased to be a passive target. If something returns momentum not as dust, but as a structure, it has geometry and a surface that behaves stably, and then the most unpleasant part emerged. The return was too pure. It didn't spread or smear over time like a cloud does. It held its shape as if it were solid. At the same time, warnings about approaching objects began to creep up on LEO again, but now they coincided in time with these peaks as if someone were tugging at a layer and the debris responded by shaking its orbits. The operators tried to chalk it up to coincidence, until they realized that the twitching wasn't happening everywhere, but along a narrow band that perfectly aligned with the Earth-Atlas axis. It looked as if ATLAS wasn't mechanically pulling debris along with it. It looked as if it was changing the conditions around Earth for seconds, and those seconds were enough to drive the statistics crazy. The scariest thing is, it didn't require a huge amount of force. A light but precise touch was enough if you knew where to press, like a finger on a string, not a hammer blow. After the third confirmation of signals, communication between the groups became sharp and brief. The words publication, press, and archive disappeared from the correspondence as if they had been deleted in advance. Almost simultaneously, several public channels updated their wording. Yesterday, it was an interesting object. Today, it's become a routine occurrence. No risks, observations are ongoing. And at that very same hour, 2 sets of raw data previously referenced by amateurs disappeared from public access. The links now lead to blank pages without explanation. A different kind of panic erupted on the forums. It wasn't everything's gone, but why did they clean it up so cleanly? When a service crashes accidentally, it crashes dirty. This felt like a careful cleanup. One of the employees, who usually keeps quiet, wrote a short message to a friend. "Don't save to the cloud, save locally. There will be fewer traces tonight than yesterday." At the same time, Hubble officially enters safe mode using standard procedure. The wording is perfectly smooth, but the window match is once again a thorn in the side. The most disturbing thing about such coincidences isn't that they happen, it's that they repeat. Repetition turns coincidence into a pattern, and a pattern requires a cause. Words like raw data embargo, chain verification, and restricting external requests have started circulating through closed channels. It sounds boring until you understand the meaning. Fewer eyes, less noise. And at that moment, the false star appeared again, but weaker, as if it weren't showing itself off but checking to see who would notice. Like a final knock before closing the door. Then something happened that sent chills down many people's spines. At one station, the return responded not to the impulse they had sent, but to a test. Internal one, not intended for external use. So someone saw more than just our scream into space. Someone saw our whispers within the system. And if that's true, then it's not a matter of the comet or the reflections, but of someone reading us. From this point on, true silence begins. Not because there's nothing to say, but because every word becomes a trace. And someone, it seems, knows how to track that trace.